There is a reason you feel tired even when nothing physical is wrong. There is a reason your mind feels heavy, your heart feels restless, and your peace disappears the moment someone else is unhappy. You have been carrying pain that was never yours to carry. You have been fixing, rescuing, explaining, and absorbing emotions that do not belong to you, all while neglecting the one person who truly needs your attention, yourself. Buddhism teaches that suffering increases not because life is cruel, but because we cling to what we cannot control. In this video, you will learn why focusing on yourself is not selfish, why carrying other people's pain is quietly destroying your peace, and how letting go is the first step toward real healing. Stay with me, because what you are about to hear may finally give you permission to put yourself first, without guilt, without fear, and without losing your compassion. 1. You are not responsible for other people's healing. One of the most hidden causes of emotional exhaustion is the belief that you must carry the pain of others in order to be a good person. Many people grow up thinking that love means sacrifice, that care means fixing, and that compassion means taking responsibility for how others feel. Because of this belief, you listen long after you are tired, you worry long after the problem is no longer in front of you, and you replay other people's struggles in your mind as if they were your own. You begin to feel guilty when they do not change, as if their lack of healing is a personal failure on your part. Over time, this creates a quiet but heavy burden inside the heart. Buddhism gently reminds us that every being walks their own karmic path. Each person arrives in this life with lessons they must face, understand, and grow through on their own. No amount of advice, emotional labor, or self-sacrifice can replace the inner work someone must choose for themselves. You can offer kindness, presence, and understanding, but you cannot do the healing for them, and trying to do so only drains your own spirit. When you attempt to walk someone else's journey, you step away from your own, leaving your inner wounds unattended and your own growth delayed. True compassion is often misunderstood. It does not mean drowning alongside someone who is struggling, nor does it mean absorbing their suffering until you break. True compassion means remaining grounded, stable, and aware while allowing others the dignity of facing their own lessons. It means trusting that people grow at their own pace and that struggle is sometimes necessary for awakening. Standing firmly on your own ground is not abandonment, it is wisdom. By staying centered, you offer a calm presence rather than a chaotic rescue. When you finally release the belief that it is your responsibility to fix people, something profound happens within you. The mind becomes lighter. The constant tension in the body begins to ease. Energy that was once trapped in worry, guilt, and emotional overinvestment returns to you. You begin to feel space inside again, space to breathe, to reflect, and to heal yourself. This is not selfishness. This is alignment with truth. By letting go of what was never yours to carry, you honor both your own path and the path of others, and in that balance, real peace begins to grow. 2. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. Many people believe that being compassionate means always being available, always listening, and always putting others before themselves. From the outside, this looks like kindness, but inside it slowly turns into exhaustion. Buddhism teaches that compassion must walk together with wisdom. Without wisdom, compassion loses balance and begins to harm the one who gives it. When you give endlessly without limits, you do not become more loving. You become depleted, confused, and emotionally fragile. When you allow everyone unrestricted access to your time, energy, and emotions, you teach your mind that your well-being comes last. You answer messages even when you are tired, stay in conversations that drain you, and absorb emotional pain that was never meant to live inside you. At first, you may feel useful or needed, But over time, this constant giving creates resentment, irritability, and inner emptiness. You may start to feel disconnected from joy, even though you are doing good things for others. This is the quiet cost of compassion without boundaries. Buddhism does not encourage self-sacrifice that leads to suffering. The middle way reminds us that extremes always create imbalance. Just as selfishness causes harm, so does self-erasure. Boundaries are not acts of cruelty, they are acts of awareness. A boundary simply says, I care, but I also care about my own peace. When you set boundaries, you protect the clarity of your mind and the stability of your heart. This allows your compassion to remain clean and sincere, rather than heavy and forced. Many people fear that setting boundaries will make them appear cold or uncaring. In truth, the opposite happens. When you protect your energy, you show up with presence rather than fatigue. You listen with attention rather than obligation. You give support without losing yourself in someone else's emotional storm. A calm and rested mind is far more helpful than one that is overwhelmed. Buddhism teaches that a peaceful presence can be more healing than 1,000 words. Without boundaries, compassion slowly turns into self-destruction because the mind is not meant to hold unlimited emotional weight. You are not designed to carry multiple lives at once. When you constantly absorb others' struggles, your inner world becomes crowded and silence disappears. Boundaries create space, and space allows awareness to return. In that space, you reconnect with your breath, your body, and your inner stillness. When compassion is guided by boundaries, it becomes sustainable. You no longer give from emptiness, but from fullness. You stop rescuing and start relating. You stop draining yourself and start honoring yourself. This is not a rejection of others, it is a return to balance. And in that balance, your compassion becomes stronger, calmer, and more truthful, benefiting both you and those around you. 3. Fixing others is often a way to avoid facing yourself. Buddhism teaches that the mind is very skilled at distraction, especially when facing inner discomfort. One of the most subtle ways we avoid our own pain is by focusing intensely on the problems of others. When you are constantly trying to fix someone, guide them, advise them, or save them from their struggles, your attention is directed outward instead of inward. This outward focus can feel like compassion, but often it is a way to escape sitting with your own unresolved emotions, fears, and wounds. Looking within requires stillness, and stillness can be uncomfortable. In silence, the mind begins to reveal what has been buried: old disappointments, unmet needs, regrets, self-doubt, and fears about the future. For many people, it feels easier to stay busy with other people's lives than to face these inner truths. Fixing others gives the illusion of purpose while quietly postponing self-understanding. You may feel useful and needed, but deep inside, your own healing remains untouched. Buddhism invites us to practice radical honesty with ourselves. It asks us to observe our intentions gently but truthfully. When you feel an urge to step into someone else's pain, it is worth asking whether this urge comes from love or from avoidance. Often, the need to control outcomes for others is rooted in our own fear of uncertainty. By trying to manage someone else's life, the mind avoids the vulnerability of accepting its own limits. When you stop fixing others, you are left alone with yourself, and this is where true transformation begins. Sitting with your own emotions without trying to escape them is a powerful act of courage. You begin to notice patterns in your thoughts, habitual reactions, and emotional triggers. This awareness is not meant to judge or punish you. Buddhism teaches that awareness itself is healing. By seeing clearly, you loosen the grip of suffering. Fixing others also creates an unconscious sense of superiority, even when intentions are kind. You may begin to believe that you know what is best for others, while ignoring the wisdom that their struggles are shaping them in ways you cannot see. Buddhism emphasizes humility, reminding us that every person's path is unique. When you release the need to intervene, you allow life to teach both you and others through direct experience rather than control. As you turn your attention inward, something subtle yet profound happens. The energy once spent on worry and intervention returns to you. You begin to develop patience with your own process. You learn to sit with discomfort without rushing to fix it. This creates emotional maturity, resilience, and deep inner calm. Over time, the desire to fix others dissolves naturally because you no longer need distraction to avoid yourself. Healing yourself does not make you less compassionate. It makes your compassion cleaner, quieter, and wiser. When your inner work becomes your priority, you interact with others from understanding rather than urgency. You listen without needing to solve. You support without needing to control. This is the essence of Buddhist wisdom. Freedom begins when you stop running from yourself and gently turn inward with awareness and kindness. 4. Carrying emotional weight that isn't yours clouds the mind. Buddhism teaches that clarity of mind is the foundation of peace, yet many people live with constant mental fog without understanding where it comes from. One of the most common causes of this inner heaviness is carrying emotional weight that does not belong to you. When you absorb other people's fears, sadness, anger, and confusion, your mind slowly loses its natural lightness. Thoughts become crowded, attention weakens, and silence disappears. You may feel tired even after rest, distracted even in calm moments, and emotionally overwhelmed without a clear reason. The mind is not designed to hold multiple lives at once. When you replay someone else's problems again and again, worry about outcomes you cannot control, or emotionally relive conversations long after they end, your inner space becomes cluttered. Buddhism describes the mind as a clear sky by nature, but emotional attachment acts like heavy clouds that block awareness. Over time, this mental congestion makes it difficult to focus, meditate, or feel present in your own life. You begin reacting instead of responding, worrying instead of observing, and surviving instead of living. Many people mistake this emotional absorption for empathy, but true empathy does not require ownership of suffering. When you carry pain that is not yours, your thoughts become tangled with emotions that have no direct connection to your present moment. You may notice anxiety rising for no clear reason, or sadness appearing suddenly during peaceful times. This happens because the mind has been trained to remain alert to problems that do not belong to you. The nervous system stays in a state of quiet tension, always prepared to respond to someone else's crisis. Buddhism teaches that suffering multiplies when we cling to what we cannot control. Other people's emotions, decisions, and healing processes fall into this category. When you attach your peace to how others feel or behave, you give your inner stability away. The mind becomes reactive, constantly scanning for emotional signals from others rather than resting in awareness. This prevents deep calm from taking root and keeps you trapped in cycles of overthinking and emotional fatigue. Letting go of emotional weight is not an act of indifference, it is an act of clarity. When you release what is not yours to carry, the mind begins to clear naturally. Thoughts slow down, breathing deepens. Awareness returns to the body and the present moment. You begin to feel grounded again, not because problems disappear, but because you are no longer holding unnecessary burdens. Buddhism teaches that peace is not created by fixing everything, but by seeing clearly what truly belongs to you. As the mind clears, something important changes. You become more present with people instead of being overwhelmed by them. You listen without absorbing. You care without carrying. Your responses become calmer and more thoughtful because they are no longer clouded by emotional overload. This clarity allows compassion to flow naturally rather than forcefully. When the mind is light, kindness feels effortless. Releasing emotional weight that does not belong to you is a return to balance. It allows you to experience life directly instead of through layers of borrowed suffering. Buddhism reminds us that freedom begins when the mind is no longer burdened by what it was never meant to hold. In that freedom, peace becomes not something you chase, but something you remember. 5. You can love others without carrying their suffering. Many people believe that love requires suffering, that to care deeply means to feel pain on behalf of others. This belief is subtle and powerful, and it often leads to emotional exhaustion without bringing real peace. Buddhism teaches a different understanding of love, one rooted in awareness rather than attachment. True love does not demand that you absorb another person's suffering into your own heart. Instead, it invites you to remain present, kind, and open while allowing each person to face their own experiences. When you carry someone else's suffering, love becomes heavy. You begin to feel anxious when they struggle, restless when they are unhappy, and responsible for emotions that are not under your control. Over time, this form of love drains your energy and clouds your judgment. You may start offering help not from calm understanding, but from fear, urgency, or guilt. Buddhism reminds us that suffering increases when we cling, even when what we cling to is love itself. Attachment turns care into burden. Loving without carrying suffering requires inner stability. It begins by recognizing that each person's pain is part of their own learning. Struggle is not always something to be removed. Sometimes it is the doorway to growth. When you accept this, you stop interfering with processes that life is using to teach. You can still offer support, but you no longer try to control outcomes. This allows love to remain gentle rather than forceful. Buddhism teaches loving kindness as a state of being rather than an emotional transaction. This means your love flows naturally without expectation or self-sacrifice. You listen when someone speaks, but you do not take their pain home with you. You care, but you do not collapse under emotional weight. You help, but you do not lose your balance. This form of love protects both your heart and your mind. When you stop carrying suffering, your presence becomes more healing. People feel calmer around you because you are not adding anxiety to their pain. You offer steadiness instead of solutions, understanding instead of control. Often, this creates more space for healing than constant advice ever could. Buddhism teaches that peace is contagious when it is genuine. Loving without carrying suffering also means trusting life. It means believing that others are capable of facing their own challenges, even when it is uncomfortable to watch. Trust does not mean indifference, it means respect. By allowing others the dignity of their own journey, you honor both them and yourself. You stop exhausting your emotional resources and begin to experience love as something light, open, and sustaining. As you practice this form of love, something shifts within you. Relationships feel less draining and more nourishing. You feel closer to people without feeling responsible for them. You experience connection without losing yourself. Buddhism teaches that this balance is not coldness, it is wisdom. When love is free from suffering, it becomes a source of peace rather than pain. 6. Healing yourself is not selfish, it is necessary. One of the most deeply rooted beliefs that keeps people trapped in exhaustion is the idea that prioritizing their own healing is selfish. Many people are taught, directly or indirectly, that a good person must always put others first, must always be available, and must always endure silently. Buddhism gently dismantles this belief by showing that a mind in pain cannot offer true compassion. When your inner world is neglected, everything you give to others becomes strained, incomplete, and eventually resentful. Healing yourself is not an act of turning away from the world, it is an act of returning to balance. Buddhism teaches that suffering arises when the mind is out of harmony with reality. If you ignore your own emotional wounds, fatigue, and inner confusion, you do not become stronger. You become fragmented. You may still appear functional on the outside, but inside there is tension, restlessness, and quiet burnout. Over time, this inner imbalance affects how you speak, how you listen, and how you relate to others. Many people try to help others while they themselves are bleeding internally. They give advice they have not yet lived. They offer patience they no longer feel. They present strength while suppressing exhaustion. Buddhism does not praise this kind of self-denial. It recognizes that unhealed pain leaks into everything. When you do not heal yourself, your kindness becomes inconsistent, your compassion becomes conditional, and your presence becomes heavy rather than calming. Healing yourself means learning to listen inward. It means noticing when the body is tense, when the mind is racing, and when emotions are being suppressed instead of understood. Buddhism teaches awareness as the first step to liberation. By becoming aware of your own suffering, you stop projecting it onto others. You stop expecting people to fill emotional gaps they were never meant to fill. This alone brings immense relief to relationships. When you prioritize your own healing, you begin to rebuild your inner foundation. You learn to rest without guilt, to say no without fear, and to sit with silence without distraction. This process is not dramatic or loud. It is quiet and often uncomfortable. Old emotions surface. Unanswered questions arise. Patterns you once ignored become visible. Buddhism teaches that this discomfort is not a sign of failure, but a sign that healing is taking place. A healed mind responds rather than reacts. When you take care of yourself, you stop snapping, over-explaining, and emotionally collapsing. You gain space between stimulus and response. In that space, wisdom appears. You begin to see situations clearly instead of emotionally. This clarity allows you to interact with others without being consumed by them. You no longer need to control outcomes because your sense of stability comes from within. Healing yourself also breaks cycles of emotional dependency. When you are unhealed, you may unconsciously seek validation, reassurance, or identity through helping others. You may feel needed, but not fulfilled. Buddhism teaches that true fulfillment comes from inner alignment, not external approval. As you heal, your need to be needed fades. You still care, but you no longer depend on others to feel whole. Many people fear that healing themselves will make them distant or cold. In reality, the opposite happens. When you are healed, your heart becomes more open because it is no longer guarded by exhaustion. You listen with patience because you are not running on empty. You give without resentment because your needs are not being ignored. Buddhism teaches that a peaceful mind radiates warmth naturally without effort. Healing yourself is necessary because it restores your ability to live consciously. Instead of being pulled into every emotional wave around you, you remain anchored. You experience emotions without drowning in them. You support others without losing yourself. This is not withdrawal from life. It is full participation with awareness. When you choose to heal, you stop repeating patterns of overgiving, self-neglect, and silent suffering. You begin to honor your limits as signals of wisdom rather than weakness. Buddhism teaches that the body and mind communicate through discomfort long before collapse. Healing means listening before breakdown occurs. As you heal, your relationships change. Some people may resist the new boundaries you create. Some may feel uncomfortable when you stop overextending. Buddhism teaches non-attachment to reactions. You are not responsible for how others respond to your growth. Your responsibility is to remain true to your path. Over time, relationships that are aligned with peace will deepen, and those built on imbalance will naturally fall away. Healing yourself is not selfish because it reduces suffering in the world rather than increasing it. A calm person does not spread chaos. A balanced mind does not provoke unnecessary conflict. A healed heart does not manipulate, control, or cling. By healing yourself, you become less reactive, less demanding, and more present. This benefits everyone you encounter. Buddhism teaches that you cannot pour clear water from a muddy cup. When your inner world is cared for, what you offer others becomes clean, steady, and sincere. Healing yourself allows compassion to flow without sacrifice, love to exist without burden, and presence to remain without exhaustion. This is why healing is not optional on the path of awareness. It is essential. 7. When you let go, you teach others without words. Buddhism teaches that the most powerful form of teaching does not come from instruction, advice, or correction. It comes from presence. When you let go of fixing others and fully commit to your own inner work, something subtle but profound begins to happen around you. Your life itself becomes the lesson. Without trying to convince, guide, or save anyone, you start to influence others simply through the way you exist in the world. Most people try to help others by talking, explaining, warning, or correcting. They believe that if they just say the right words, the other person will finally understand and change. Buddhism reminds us that transformation rarely happens through force or persuasion. Real change happens when someone feels it for themselves. When you stop interfering and instead embody calm, awareness, and balance, others naturally become curious. They begin to sense that something about you is different, lighter, steadier, and more grounded. Letting go does not mean withdrawing from humanity or becoming indifferent. It means releasing control over outcomes. When you stop trying to manage how others think, feel, or behave, your energy returns to the present moment. Your mind becomes quieter. Your body relaxes. You speak less, but when you do speak, your words carry weight. Buddhism teaches that silence born from clarity is far more powerful than endless speech born from anxiety. As you heal and let go, your reactions change. Situations that once triggered urgency, frustration, or emotional over-involvement no longer pull you in. You begin responding with patience instead of panic, with understanding instead of resistance. This shift is visible. People around you feel it, even if they cannot explain it. Your calm presence becomes a mirror, reflecting back to them their own restlessness or peace. Buddhism emphasizes that suffering is deeply personal, and so is awakening. When you stop trying to rescue others, you give them the space to encounter their own inner truth. This can feel uncomfortable at first, especially if you are used to being the emotional support, the fixer, or the strong one. But allowing others to face their own lessons is an act of deep respect. It says, without words, "I trust your ability to grow." When you let go, you also stop feeding unhealthy dynamics. Many relationships are built on imbalance, where one person carries emotional weight while the other avoids responsibility. By stepping back, you quietly change the structure of the relationship. Some people may feel confused or even resistant because they are no longer being rescued. Buddhism teaches non-attachment to these reactions. Growth often disrupts familiar patterns before peace settles in. Teaching without words requires inner stability. It requires that you no longer seek validation through being needed. As you heal, the desire to prove your worth by helping others fades. You no longer need to be the solution to feel valuable. This creates a deep sense of freedom. You begin to act from awareness rather than obligation. Your kindness becomes intentional instead of compulsive. When others observe your calmness during difficulty, they learn something important without being told. When they see you setting boundaries without anger, they learn that peace does not require aggression. When they notice that you are no longer overwhelmed by problems that once consumed you, they begin to question their own patterns. This is how teaching happens naturally. Not through correction, but through embodiment. Buddhism teaches that the mind influences other minds not through force, but through resonance. A peaceful mind invites peace. A grounded presence encourages grounding. As you let go of emotional entanglement, your energy becomes lighter and more stable. People feel safer around you because you are not reacting unpredictably or absorbing their emotions. This safety allows them to reflect rather than defend. Letting go also deepens your connection to life itself. When you are no longer preoccupied with managing others, you begin to notice simple things again. The rhythm of your breath, the sensations in your body, the quiet moments between thoughts. Buddhism teaches that awakening is found in ordinary awareness, not in dramatic intervention. By returning to simplicity, you align with life as it is, rather than constantly trying to reshape it. Some people will learn from your example, others will not. Buddhism teaches acceptance of this truth. Not everyone is ready to awaken at the same time. Letting go means releasing the need to be understood or followed. Your task is not to bring everyone with you, but to walk your path with sincerity. Those who are meant to learn from you will do so naturally, without pressure. When you let go fully, something remarkable happens within you. You stop feeling responsible for everyone's happiness. You stop carrying guilt for outcomes you cannot control. You stop exhausting yourself trying to prevent pain. In this freedom, compassion becomes effortless. You care without clinging. You help without losing yourself. You love without suffering. Buddhism teaches that liberation is not about escaping the world, but about engaging with it wisely. When you stop fixing others and focus on your own awareness, you do not abandon compassion, you refine it. Your presence becomes calm rather than chaotic, supportive rather than controlling, healing rather than draining. Teaching without words is the highest form of influence. It requires no effort, no persuasion, and no exhaustion. It arises naturally when you live in alignment with awareness. When you let go, you do not become smaller, you become clearer. And in that clarity, your life itself becomes a quiet teaching, guiding others simply by being what peace looks like. 8. Inner peace begins when you stop carrying what you cannot control. One of the most exhausting habits of the human mind is trying to control what was never meant to be controlled. Buddhism teaches that much of our suffering does not come from pain itself, but from resistance to reality. When you carry the emotions, decisions, reactions, and outcomes of other people, you are silently fighting life. You are asking the world to behave according to your expectations, and when it does not, the mind tightens, the heart grows heavy, and peace slips away. Many people believe that worrying deeply about others is a sign of love. In reality, it is often a sign of attachment mixed with fear. You worry because you want things to go a certain way. You carry emotional weight because you are afraid of loss, failure, or disappointment. Buddhism teaches that attachment always creates tension because it binds your inner peace to forces outside your control. Other people's choices, moods, and growth timelines do not belong to you, yet the mind repeatedly tries to manage them. When you attempt to control what others feel or become, you slowly lose contact with the present moment. Your thoughts jump ahead into imagined futures or replay past conversations endlessly. The body remains tense, as if preparing for a problem that may never arrive. This constant mental movement drains your energy and creates anxiety that has no clear source. Buddhism reminds us that peace is found only here and now, not in imagined outcomes or unfulfilled expectations. Letting go of control does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop forcing. There is a deep difference between involvement and entanglement. Involvement allows compassion to flow naturally, while entanglement traps the mind in worry. When you release the need to control outcomes, you return to involvement without attachment. You can be present without being consumed. You can care without collapsing. Buddhism teaches acceptance as a form of strength, not weakness. Acceptance does not mean approval, and it does not mean passivity. It means recognizing what is happening without fighting it internally. When you accept that you cannot control another person's healing, emotions, or awakening, the mind relaxes. This relaxation creates space for clarity. In that space, you begin to see what is actually within your power, your breath, your responses, your actions, and your awareness. As you practice letting go, you may notice resistance at first. The mind is accustomed to control because control feels like safety. Releasing it can feel like stepping into uncertainty. Buddhism teaches that uncertainty is not the enemy. Clinging is. When you allow uncertainty to exist without trying to resolve it immediately, the mind gradually learns trust. Trust does not come from guarantees. It comes from understanding impermanence. Impermanence is a core teaching in Buddhism. Everything changes, whether you worry or not. People evolve, relationships shift, emotions rise and fall. When you carry what you cannot control, you suffer twice. First, from the situation itself, and second, from your resistance to its natural flow. Letting go removes the second layer of suffering. Life still unfolds, but your inner world becomes lighter. When you stop carrying what you cannot control, your attention returns to your own inner state. You begin to notice subtle signs of tension and release them before they grow. You learn to pause before reacting. You respond with awareness rather than habit. This shift is quiet but powerful. It transforms how you experience daily life. Ordinary moments become calmer because the mind is no longer overloaded with borrowed concerns. Buddhism teaches that true freedom comes from knowing where your responsibility ends. You are responsible for your intentions, your effort, and your conduct. You are not responsible for how others receive, interpret, or act upon them. Understanding this boundary brings immense relief. You stop blaming yourself for outcomes you could not control. Guilt loosens its grip, self-judgment softens. As inner peace grows, your interactions change. You listen more deeply because you are not planning solutions. You speak more carefully because you are not driven by urgency. You become less reactive to emotional storms around you because you recognize that not every wave requires your participation. Buddhism teaches that the wise person learns when to act and when to remain still. Letting go of control also restores joy. When the mind is no longer burdened by constant concern, it becomes receptive again. You notice beauty in small things. You feel gratitude without forcing it. You experience moments of contentment without explanation. This joy is not dependent on perfect circumstances. It arises naturally from inner balance. Some people may misunderstand your calm as detachment or distance. Buddhism teaches that misunderstanding is part of life. You are not meant to manage perceptions. As you walk your path with sincerity, clarity replaces explanation. Those who are ready will feel the peace you carry. Those who are not may resist it. Both outcomes are acceptable. When you stop carrying what you cannot control, you align with reality instead of fighting it. You move with life rather than against it. Inner peace is not something you achieve through effort alone. It is something you uncover by removing unnecessary burdens. Buddhism teaches that the mind is peaceful by nature. It is disturbance that is learned. By letting go again and again, moment by moment, you train the mind to return to simplicity. You stop overcomplicating life. You stop measuring your worth through outcomes. You stop exhausting yourself trying to hold the world together. In this simplicity, peace becomes stable, not fragile. Inner peace begins the moment you understand this truth deeply. You were never meant to carry everything. When you release what is beyond your control, you finally have the strength to carry what truly belongs to you. And in that balance, life feels lighter, clearer, and quietly complete. 9. Returning to yourself is the deepest form of freedom. There comes a quiet moment on the path of awareness when you realize that much of your life has been lived outward instead of inward. Your attention has been scattered across other people's emotions, expectations, disappointments, and needs, leaving very little space for your own inner life. Buddhism teaches that suffering continues, not because life is cruel, but because the mind forgets where it truly belongs. When you return to yourself, not in isolation but in awareness, you reclaim a freedom that was never lost, only neglected. Returning to yourself does not mean becoming disconnected from others. It means recentering your attention where it was always meant to rest. When the mind constantly lives inside other people's stories, it loses contact with its own experience. You begin to measure your worth by how useful you are, how much you give, or how well you hold everything together. Buddhism gently reminds us that your value does not come from effort or sacrifice. It comes from being fully present in your own life. Many people fear returning to themselves because they associate it with loneliness or selfishness. In truth, it is neither. Returning to yourself means finally listening to what your body has been saying through fatigue, tension, and restlessness. It means allowing emotions to surface without pushing them away or distracting yourself with responsibility for others. Buddhism teaches that awareness is not something you add to life. It is something you uncover when you stop abandoning yourself. When you stop carrying the emotional weight of others, you create space to feel your own inner landscape clearly. At first, this can feel unfamiliar. There may be silence where there was once noise, and uncertainty where there was once obligation. The mind may try to pull you back into old patterns of overthinking, worrying, or fixing, because those patterns feel familiar. Buddhism teaches patience with this process. Freedom does not arrive suddenly. It unfolds gently as the mind learns to rest in itself again. Returning to yourself also means accepting your limits without shame. You begin to understand that you cannot be everything to everyone, and that this was never required of you. The need to prove your worth through constant availability slowly dissolves. In its place, a quiet confidence emerges. You begin to trust your own rhythm, your own pace, and your own needs. This trust creates stability that no external validation can replace. Buddhism teaches that the self we return to is not an ego to be inflated, but a presence to be inhabited. It is the awareness behind your thoughts, the calm beneath emotions, the stillness that remains when you stop identifying with every mental movement. As you return to this inner ground, life feels less chaotic. Challenges still arise, but they no longer define you. You experience difficulty without becoming it. When you are rooted in yourself, your relationships transform naturally. You stop seeking completion through others. You stop expecting people to fill emotional gaps that only awareness can hold. This removes pressure from connections and allows them to become more authentic. You relate from wholeness rather than need. Buddhism teaches that relationships built on presence rather than dependence are lighter, clearer, and more honest. Returning to yourself also changes how you experience solitude. What once felt empty begins to feel spacious. Silence no longer feels threatening because you are no longer running from yourself. In that silence, you reconnect with simple existence. You notice your breath, your posture, and the quiet flow of time. Buddhism teaches that peace is not found by adding more to life, but by meeting life as it already is. As this return deepens, you stop reacting impulsively to external demands. You pause before responding. You listen without losing yourself. You act with intention instead of urgency. This does not make you passive. It makes you clear. Your actions become aligned rather than reactive. You stop being pulled in multiple directions and begin moving forward with quiet confidence. Returning to yourself is also an act of courage. It requires letting go of identities built around being the helper, the fixer, or the strong one. These roles may have once protected you, but they no longer define who you are. Buddhism teaches impermanence not as loss, but as freedom. When old roles fall away, space opens for a more authentic way of living. The deepest freedom Buddhism points to is not escape from responsibility, but freedom from unnecessary suffering. When you return to yourself, you stop carrying burdens that were never yours. You stop living on emotional alert for other people's lives. You begin living fully in your own. This presence brings a sense of completeness that does not depend on circumstances. Returning to yourself does not end compassion, it refines it. You become compassionate without being consumed. You care without clinging. You support without sacrificing your inner peace. This is mature compassion, born from awareness rather than obligation. It allows you to stay open without being overwhelmed. In this return, you discover something simple yet profound. You were never meant to disappear into others. You were meant to inhabit your own life fully. Buddhism teaches that awakening is not becoming someone else. It is becoming present to who you already are. When you return to yourself, freedom stops being a distant idea and becomes a lived experience, quiet, steady, and deeply fulfilling. 10. Living from inner wholeness ends the need to be needed. One of the most subtle forms of suffering is the need to be needed. It often disguises itself as kindness, responsibility, loyalty, or love, yet beneath it lies a quiet hunger for validation and purpose. Buddhism teaches that suffering continues when the mind seeks completion outside itself. When your sense of worth depends on being useful, helpful, or emotionally indispensable to others, your peace becomes fragile. It rises and falls based on how much others rely on you. Living from inner wholeness dissolves this dependence and restores a freedom that does not require approval. Many people build their identity around being the one who holds everything together. They become the listener, the fixer, the emotional anchor. Over time, this role feels essential, even virtuous. Yet Buddhism invites us to look deeper. When your value comes from being needed, you unconsciously fear being replaced, ignored, or no longer useful. This fear keeps the mind alert and tense, always scanning for where it must intervene next. Wholeness cannot grow in a mind that never rests. Living from inner wholeness begins with recognizing that your existence does not need justification. You do not need to earn rest, peace, or dignity through service. Buddhism teaches that being itself is enough. When you stop measuring your worth through effort and sacrifice, the nervous system relaxes, the body softens, the mind stops bracing itself against invisibility. This relaxation is not laziness. It is alignment with reality. The need to be needed often develops early in life. Some learn that love arrives only when they are useful. Others learn that safety comes from anticipating others' needs. These patterns become habits of survival. Buddhism does not judge these habits. It simply invites awareness. When you see clearly how the need to be needed shapes your actions, you begin to loosen its grip. Awareness turns compulsion into choice. Living from wholeness means meeting your own emotional needs directly rather than outsourcing them. Instead of seeking reassurance through helping, you learn to offer reassurance to yourself through presence. Instead of seeking identity through responsibility, you discover identity through awareness. Buddhism teaches that when the mind rests in itself, it no longer chases confirmation of its value. As inner wholeness grows, something remarkable happens. You still help others, but your help is no longer driven by fear or obligation. You give because you choose to, not because you must. You stop over-explaining, over-giving, and overextending. Your yes becomes sincere, and your no becomes peaceful. This clarity creates respect, both within yourself and in others. Living from wholeness also changes how you experience usefulness. You no longer panic when you are not needed. Silence no longer feels threatening. Stillness becomes nourishing. Buddhism teaches that emptiness is not absence, but openness. When you are no longer filling every space with effort, life has room to breathe through you. Wholeness removes the urgency from relationships. You stop clinging to roles that keep you emotionally busy but spiritually tired. You allow others to experience their own strength rather than depending on yours. This can feel uncomfortable at first, especially if your identity has long been tied to being the reliable one. Buddhism teaches patience with this discomfort. It is the sign of old conditioning dissolving. When you live from wholeness, your presence becomes cleaner. You are no longer manipulating situations to feel needed. You are no longer rescuing to feel secure. You show up honestly, without hidden expectations. This authenticity deepens relationships rather than weakening them. People feel your sincerity instead of your effort. Inner wholeness also protects you from resentment. When you no longer give to fill a void, you do not feel bitter when others fail to appreciate you. You stop counting emotional debts. You stop silently expecting returns on kindness. Buddhism teaches non-attachment to outcomes, and wholeness makes this teaching lived rather than theoretical. Living from wholeness does not mean withdrawing from compassion. It means embodying it fully. Compassion rooted in wholeness is steady, quiet, and sustainable. It does not exhaust the giver or entangle the receiver. It respects autonomy while offering presence. This is mature compassion, free from ego and fear. As you live from wholeness, you notice a deep internal stability. External circumstances lose their power to shake you. Praise no longer inflates you. Rejection no longer collapses you. You begin responding to life rather than negotiating your worth with it. Buddhism teaches that freedom arises when the mind stops grasping for identity. The end of the need to be needed is not the end of connection. It is the beginning of true connection. You relate from fullness rather than lack. You share from abundance rather than emptiness. You listen without losing yourself. You love without disappearing. This balance is not learned overnight. It grows gradually through awareness, patience, and self-honesty. Living from inner wholeness also reconnects you with simplicity. You stop complicating life through emotional over-involvement. You appreciate moments as they are rather than as opportunities to prove yourself. Buddhism teaches that contentment is found not in doing more, but in seeing clearly. When wholeness becomes your foundation, life feels less heavy. You stop carrying invisible responsibilities. You stop managing emotions that are not yours. You begin trusting the natural intelligence of life. This trust brings peace that does not depend on being needed, praised, or validated. In the end, Buddhism teaches that awakening is not becoming indispensable to the world, but becoming present to your own existence. When you live from inner wholeness, you no longer need to be needed to feel whole. You simply are. And in that being, compassion flows effortlessly, relationships become honest, and life unfolds with quiet dignity and deep peace. 11. Freedom arrives when you stop abandoning yourself. One of the quietest yet most painful forms of suffering is self-abandonment. It does not arrive loudly, nor does it announce itself as harm. It appears gradually through small choices to ignore your own needs, silence your feelings, override your intuition, and stay in situations that drain you because you fear disappointing others. Buddhism teaches that much of human suffering does not come from external hardship, but from the moment the mind turns away from itself in order to survive, belong, or be accepted. Self-abandonment often begins with good intentions. You learn to adjust, to compromise, to be understanding, to endure. Over time, this endurance becomes habit. You stop listening to your inner signals because they seem inconvenient. Fatigue is ignored. Emotional discomfort is rationalized. Inner resistance is labeled selfishness. Slowly, you lose touch with your own center. You may still function, still help others, still appear strong, yet inside there is a quiet emptiness that no amount of effort seems to fill. Buddhism teaches that awareness is the act of returning. When you begin to notice how often you override your own truth, you are already stepping back toward freedom. Self-abandonment is not a moral failure. It is a learned response to fear, fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of being alone. The mind believes that safety lies in pleasing, fixing, or enduring, but this safety is fragile. It requires constant effort and produces constant tension. When you abandon yourself, your inner world becomes divided. One part of you feels discomfort, exhaustion, or sadness, while another part forces continuation. This inner split creates suffering because the mind is no longer unified. Buddhism teaches that peace arises when the mind is whole, not when it is controlled. Wholeness means allowing inner signals to be heard without judgment or suppression. Freedom begins when you stop betraying your own experience. This does not mean acting on every impulse. It means acknowledging what is present without denial. When you feel tired, you allow rest. When something feels wrong, you pause instead of pushing forward. When your intuition signals misalignment, you listen rather than override. Buddhism teaches that the body and mind are wise teachers when given space to speak. Stopping self-abandonment requires courage. It may disappoint people who benefited from your silence. It may disrupt patterns that depended on your compliance. Buddhism teaches non-attachment to approval. You are not responsible for maintaining comfort at the expense of truth. Your responsibility is to live with awareness. When you honor your inner reality, you align with the natural order rather than resisting it. As you stop abandoning yourself, you may notice guilt arising. This guilt is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is a residue of conditioning. The mind has learned that self-care equals selfishness. Buddhism invites you to observe this guilt without obeying it. Over time, as you continue choosing alignment, the guilt softens. In its place grows a quiet sense of dignity. Returning to yourself restores trust. When you repeatedly ignore your own needs, the mind learns that it cannot rely on you. Anxiety grows because there is no internal refuge. When you begin honoring your limits and emotions, trust returns. The mind relaxes because it knows it will be heard. This trust becomes an inner stability that does not depend on circumstances. Buddhism teaches that freedom is not found by controlling life, but by ceasing internal violence. Self-abandonment is a subtle form of violence against your own experience. It says, "What I feel does not matter." When you stop this pattern, suffering decreases not because life becomes easy, but because you stop fighting yourself. As inner alignment strengthens, your actions become more authentic. You speak more honestly, not aggressively. You step back when needed, without explanation. You choose presence over performance. This authenticity is felt by others. Some may resist it, others may respect it. Buddhism teaches equanimity toward both. Your task is not to manage reactions, but to remain rooted. Stopping self-abandonment also transforms compassion. When you no longer neglect yourself, your compassion becomes grounded rather than compulsive. You help without depletion. You listen without erasing yourself. You give without resentment. Buddhism teaches that true compassion includes oneself. Without self-compassion, compassion for others becomes distorted. Freedom deepens as you learn to stay with yourself during discomfort. Instead of escaping through distraction or responsibility, you sit with what arises. You feel emotions without drowning in them. You allow uncertainty without rushing to resolve it. Buddhism teaches that this ability to remain present is the foundation of liberation. When you stop abandoning yourself, you reclaim your life energy. Energy once spent suppressing, enduring, and compensating returns to you. You feel more alive, not because circumstances change, but because you are no longer divided. Inner peace becomes possible because there is no longer a part of you being ignored. This freedom does not remove pain from life. It removes unnecessary suffering. Pain still arises, but it is met with presence instead of resistance. You become intimate with your own experience rather than estranged from it. Buddhism teaches that intimacy with reality is awakening. In the end, freedom arrives quietly. It is not dramatic or loud. It feels like coming home after a long journey. You recognize yourself again, not as a role, not as a function, but as awareness itself. When you stop abandoning yourself, you stop living in fragments. You become whole. And in that wholeness, life flows with less struggle, deeper honesty, and a peace that does not depend on circumstances. 12. Stillness is where you finally stop carrying the world. At some point on the path of awareness, you realize that effort has limits. You have tried understanding everything, fixing everything, carrying everyone, and holding life together through sheer mental strength. Buddhism teaches that this endless effort is not wisdom, but restlessness. True peace does not arrive through more doing. It arrives through stillness. Stillness is not emptiness, weakness, or withdrawal. It is the place where the mind finally stops carrying what it was never meant to hold. Most suffering continues because the mind is constantly in motion. It plans, remembers, anticipates, worries, and manages. Even when the body rests, the mind keeps working. It replays conversations, imagines outcomes, and prepares for emotional responsibilities that may never come. Buddhism teaches that this constant movement creates a false sense of control. In reality, it keeps the nervous system tense and the heart burdened. Stillness is the moment the mind lays everything down. Stillness begins when you stop trying to hold life together internally. You stop rehearsing responses. You stop solving imaginary problems. You stop scanning for what needs fixing next. At first, this can feel uncomfortable, even frightening, because the mind is used to effort. Effort feels like safety. Stillness feels like vulnerability. Buddhism teaches that this discomfort is the doorway, not the danger. When you stay with stillness instead of escaping it, the mind begins to soften. In stillness, you begin to notice how much weight you have been carrying unconsciously. Emotional responsibility for others, fear of disappointing people, the need to be prepared at all times. The belief that rest must be earned. As awareness deepens, you see that none of these burdens are required in this moment. The present moment does not ask you to carry the past or control the future. It simply asks you to be here. Buddhism teaches that stillness is not created. It is uncovered. When effort drops, stillness remains. When thought slows, awareness becomes clear. You realize that beneath the constant noise of the mind, there has always been a quiet presence. This presence does not worry. It does not fix. It does not resist. It observes with calm attention. Returning to this presence is returning to yourself. In stillness, identity loosens. You are no longer the helper, the fixer, the strong one, or the responsible one. You are simply aware. This can feel unfamiliar at first because many people have built their sense of self around roles and responsibilities. Buddhism teaches that clinging to identity creates suffering because identities require maintenance. Stillness frees you from this effort. You do not need to perform to exist. As you remain in stillness, emotional patterns begin to reveal themselves without effort. You notice urges to intervene, to speak, to solve. Instead of obeying them, you observe. This observation weakens their grip. Over time, the compulsion to carry others begins to dissolve naturally. Not through force, but through understanding. Buddhism teaches that what is seen clearly no longer controls you. Stillness also restores sensitivity. When the mind is no longer overloaded, you become more attuned to subtle signals from the body and heart. You notice when something feels aligned and when it does not. You sense when to engage and when to step back. This intuitive clarity is not intellectual. It arises naturally from presence. Buddhism teaches that wisdom is quiet, not loud. In stillness, compassion changes form. It no longer rushes. It no longer tries to rescue. It becomes spacious. You allow others to be as they are without internal resistance. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop suffering on behalf of others. Compassion becomes gentle attention rather than emotional labor. This is compassion without exhaustion. Many people fear stillness because they associate it with loneliness. In truth, stillness reveals connection. When the mind quiets, the sense of separation softens. You feel connected to life not through effort, but through shared presence. Buddhism teaches that stillness dissolves the illusion that you must manage everything alone. You begin to trust the natural unfolding of life. Stillness also changes how you experience time. Urgency fades. You no longer feel pressured to resolve everything immediately. Patience arises naturally because you are no longer chasing outcomes. Buddhism teaches that time feels heavy only when the mind resists the present. When resistance ends, time becomes spacious. As stillness deepens, fear loses power. Fear feeds on imagination and anticipation. In stillness, you are no longer projecting yourself into future scenarios. You are anchored in now. This anchoring brings a quiet courage. You realize that you can meet whatever arises one moment at a time. You do not need to carry tomorrow today. Stillness does not remove action from life. It purifies it. When action arises from stillness, it is precise and appropriate. You speak when needed. You act when necessary. You rest when required. There is no excess. Buddhism teaches that right action flows naturally from right awareness. In stillness, you finally stop carrying the world because you realize the world was never asking to be carried. You were responding to fear, conditioning, and habit. When these dissolve, life continues without collapse. Others find their way. Situations resolve or change. You remain present rather than overwhelmed. This is not indifference, it is trust. Trust in life, trust in impermanence, trust in the intelligence that moves through all things. Buddhism teaches that surrender is not giving up. It is letting go of the illusion of control. Stillness is the expression of this surrender. As you live from stillness, peace becomes stable. Not because life becomes predictable, but because your inner world is no longer at war with reality. You experience joy without clinging, sorrow without collapse, and love without possession. This balance is the fruit of letting go. In the end, stillness feels like coming home. There is nothing to fix, nothing to prove, nothing to carry. You rest in awareness, and awareness holds you. This is the quiet freedom Buddhism points to. Not escape from life, but deep presence within it. When you stop carrying the world, you finally have the strength to live fully, gently, and awake. If there is one truth that quietly runs through every lesson you have heard, it is this: your suffering did not come from caring too much, but from forgetting yourself while caring. You were never meant to carry the emotional weight of the world, never meant to fix every broken heart, never meant to sacrifice your inner peace to prove your goodness. Buddhism teaches that suffering continues not because life is cruel, but because the mind clings to roles, responsibilities, and burdens that were never truly its own. When you spend your life fixing others, you slowly abandon yourself. You silence your intuition, ignore your exhaustion, and suppress your truth in the name of compassion. Over time, this creates inner conflict. One part of you keeps giving, while another part grows tired, resentful, and empty. Peace becomes distant, not because it is unavailable, but because you have been living away from your own center. The path you have explored is not about becoming cold, distant, or indifferent. It is about becoming honest. Honest about your limits. Honest about what you can and cannot control. Honest about the cost of carrying pain that does not belong to you. Buddhism teaches that wisdom begins when compassion is guided by awareness. Without awareness, compassion becomes self-harm. With awareness, compassion becomes calm, steady, and deeply healing. As you let go of fixing, rescuing, and carrying, you begin to feel space inside again. Space to breathe without guilt. Space to rest without explanation. Space to exist without performing usefulness. In this space, stillness emerges naturally, and in stillness, the mind remembers its true nature. It was never meant to be tense, overworked, or constantly alert. It was meant to be clear, present, and at ease. Returning to yourself is not retreating from life. It is meeting life honestly. You stop fighting reality internally. You stop demanding that people change so you can feel safe. You stop carrying tomorrow's worries today. You learn to stand in the present moment, rooted, aware, and whole. From this place, your actions become simpler, your words become fewer, and your presence becomes stronger. When you live from inner wholeness, something beautiful happens without effort. You no longer spread anxiety. You no longer transmit urgency. You no longer reinforce emotional chaos. Instead, you offer calm simply by being calm. You teach without words. You guide without pushing. You help without losing yourself. This is the highest form of compassion Buddhism points to, a peaceful presence that does not demand sacrifice. Some people will understand your change. Others will not. This is not your responsibility. Buddhism teaches non-attachment to outcomes, including how others perceive your growth. Your task is not to be needed, approved of, or praised. Your task is to live awake, to listen inward, to honor your limits, to remain present with what is true. In the end, peace is not something you achieve by effort. It is something you uncover by letting go of control, letting go of guilt, letting go of the belief that your worth depends on how much you carry. When these burdens fall away, what remains is simple awareness, quiet, steady, enough. This is where the journey leads, not to isolation, but to balance, not to indifference, but to wise compassion, not to emptiness, but to fullness without attachment. When you stop fixing others and begin living from stillness, life no longer feels like something you must survive. It becomes something you can finally experience. And in that experience, suffering softens, clarity returns, and peace is no longer a distant idea. It becomes the ground beneath your feet, steady, silent, and always available, the moment you stop carrying what was never yours to hold.